it's a lot to sit there with the crimes, the horrors that the Russian army has committed and that Russian society has been very largely complicit in. And since Russia cannot be defeated in a way like in 1945 for obvious reasons, because it has a huge nuclear arsenal, it will be on Russians to sort of come to terms with their own history and to come to terms with any defeat. And I imagine, like most nations would, they will try to find a way to make it not about them, but about something else that happened, or somebody else, and a group a group can externalize.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we're joined by Dr Jade McGlynn, a research fellow from the Department of War Studies at King's College London and author of 2 in-depth books on Russia, Memory Makers, The Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia and Russia's War. Jade, welcome to Frontline. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You've been exploring the war in Ukraine very much from the Russian perspective by looking at how the Russian understanding of history and identity shapes the Russian viewpoint. In broad terms, can you describe what that is exactly?
Mm-hmm. So my approach since 2014, when the war began, has really been to understand where the support for aggression in Ukraine and the particular idea of Russia and its place in the world and why Russia should have that particular place in the world comes from. And if I had to generalize in a very, very quick term, it would be that Russia has a right to interfere in a certain space, sort of its neighboring geographical or geopolitical space, because Russia is an innately great power with a mission to play in the world, often a sort of anti-Western mission, or at least a counter-Western mission, and that in order to pursue that mission, it needs a very strong state, which then justifies the sacrifices that are also required internally.
So your starting point for your research is examining from the beginning of the annexation of Crimea. How does that perception of Russia, how does Putin use that perception, history, to justify that perception of Russia?
This is a crucial point. Thank you for asking. So history, particularly since 2012, when there were mass protests around Putin's return to the presidency, history really became the cornerstone of Russia's national story, in particular the cult of the Great Patriotic War, which is what Russia calls the Soviet fight against Nazism from 1941 to 1945. And of course, part of the reason it starts in 1941 is so that it doesn't have to discuss the awkwardness of what did happen in 1939, such as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with its secret protocols. And the idea is that because the Soviet Union, which is often then reduced to Russia in this narrative, in the Kremlin's narrative, won World War II, the Great Patriotic War, therefore Russia has a right to all of the lands that it sort of occupied or essentially controlled after that time. And we saw this in 2021 with Putin's ultimatum just before the start of the full-scale invasion. He asked for a return for NATO to leave all of those areas that had joined NATO since 1997. And this was about returning to a status and also a geopolitical reality that Russia feels it deserves and it has a right to.
And why does the Kremlin or Putin himself relies so much on history? Why does he draw on history to make his points?
Mm-hmm. Well, we all do it a little bit. I mean, everybody makes sense of the future or their lives by thinking about, what's happened in their experience. So to a certain level, that's a human thing. And of course, every single country does it. Every single country has a mythical past. Russia is not the only country to have a World War II obsession, to put it mildly. However, the difference is firstly the intensity and also the fact that there really isn't much else for Russia to rely on. It never really had the nationalism, if we talk about sort of the 19th century nationalism that came across in Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine. It never really had that formation. And so that's one aspect. Also, you can't use religion because there are 4 official religions. You can't use ethnicity because, Russia is an incredibly multi-ethnic country. You can't use civic identity because of the nature of the Kremlin's regime. You can't use a proper ideology like communism because, bluntly, there isn't one. And so you're really left with a bit of emptiness in terms of explaining why Russia is a nation. And so to cohere that sense of why Russians belong together, why they are special, what makes them Russia, they've relied very heavily on history, on different aspects of it, but particularly on this messianic role.
Do you think then that Russia, in that light, has struggled with its identity after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yes, exactly. So Yeltsin actually sponsored this big search to try to find, Boris Yeltsin sponsored this big search to try to find, a workable definition of, or some sort of form of workable Russian identity, and nothing really came of it. There was this big nationwide competition. And then when Putin comes to power, one of his first steps is to try to reclaim the past, try to create some sense of continuity, which was important for a nation that really did feel quite traumatized by the upheavals of the 1990s. And it wasn't just a case of, oh, we lost the empire. It was also Russia was in a very particular position where if the Baltic states, if Ukraine, if everybody pretty much could externalize the Soviet and therefore celebrate the end of the Soviet Union in some way as, okay, a freedom from oppression, that's very hard for Russia to do. And one of the bigger issues historically has been Russia's inability to differentiate itself as a nation from the imperial center. So from the Soviet Union in this example.
And today, free speech and any political dissent is stamped upon in a very violent and decisive way. How has access to information, though, inside Russia changed since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
So you're right, there was a huge crackdown in terms of freedom of expression laws, which were already pretty oppressive in early March, so just a week or two after the invasion. However, what we've also seen at the same time is, whilst television has always been, not always, but has long been under quite strict controls, there's sort of ideological manuals that are given out in order so that people know, or the journalists, the editors know exactly what lines to follow. What you had after the full-scale invasion was people flocked to Telegram, which is somewhere between a mix, I suppose, between Twitter and WhatsApp. And it's a very popular app, and 60 million Russians use it every single day. And the vast majority of them use it to check news. And on Telegram, unlike on television, you have access to whatever information you like. You can read any opposition channels, you can read foreign news, you can really read whatever you like. However, what's interesting is that of the top 30 sort of political channels or news channels, 24 of them are quite stridently pro-war. And so there's also other questions. Yes, of course, propaganda works because it has this platform, and it has a huge platform that's, quite scarily entrenched in Russia, but it also works because it has some resonance. And I think that's the overlooked aspect sometimes.
And what about what's available on television since the invasion?
Mm-hmm. So television, from the start, they cancelled, at the very start of the full-scale invasion, they pretty much cancelled all of the series, all of the nice shows, if we put it that way. And they just had these sort of over-the-top political discussion shows that are developed as a form of entertainment. These shows shouldn't be understood as representing the Kremlin's line. They're often sort of outrageous, developed at like high viewing figures and so on. However, after the call for mobilization around this time last year, which shocked many Russians began to not want to watch these political discussion shows. They wanted escapism. The war had become too real. It wasn't a special military operation anymore because they might be sent to die. There was the likelihood they would be sent to die, and it was much higher. And so what you see is all of the television channels, apart from one group which is not reliant on advertising, and the other ones are still reliant on advertising, those television channels switched. They turned down the amount of political discussion shows, and they increased the number of soaps, television series, historical period dramas, and so on, in order to cater to that demand for escapism. And that's a demand that we see continuing.
Can you explain how the Kremlin has built up its justification for the invasion, the idea that Nazis pose this direct threat to Russians? What elements of history has Putin drawn upon to try and add credibility to his narrative?
Mm-hmm. So this is a really important point because this goes back, even beyond 2014. In particular, in 2014, this was a really intense element in the description of the Revolution of Dignity, when Ukrainians protested against, I suppose, the nepotism and corruption and pro-Russian political choices of then President Viktor Yanukovych. And the idea there was anybody protesting was what was called, and I'm talking about domestic propaganda here, was what was called a banderovец. So this means a follower of Stepan Bandera, who was one of several Ukrainian nationalist leaders, and he was sort of one of the more extreme ones. He called, for example, to work with the Germans in the early years of the war in order to defeat the Soviets, and had a pretty unpleasant ideology, to be honest, however you feel about Ukraine's right to be an independent state. So this was the idea, was essentially to completely discredit any form of Ukrainian sovereignty or just choice for itself by dismissing everybody as if they were just fascist, bluntly. And it drew on this propaganda line that was also very prevalent in the Soviet Union. Whenever there were Ukrainians who were trying to sort of protect their culture, protect their language, it was also used then to discredit them. And it's this notion that Ukrainians are somehow a nation of collaborators, a nation of traitors. And it's completely not backed up in any way. Actually, the most numerous proportionally and numerically country in terms of collaborators was Russia itself in the Vlasov Sea. Not that that has any meaning on anything today politically, but it's also historically completely unfounded. So it worked very well. If you go back to 2014 and look at the opinion polls, you can see that whilst only 9% of Russians thought that the Russian government had any blame for the annexation of Crimea, as bizarre as that sounds, over 60% thought that Ukrainian nationalists did. And so this idea that there are nationalists in power, this comes up quite a lot. Even now, if you speak to some people who are against the war, they will say, well, they shouldn't really have allowed the nationalists or the Banderites, the Banderovцы, to be in power. And it's very prevalent. And it's just a sense of, it doesn't sound quite as extreme as perhaps it can appear to the English listener. Oh, okay, well, there are just these Nazis. And I remember having people asking me, oh, where did this come from? Why would anybody believe that? But when it builds on a trope that's existed for decades, that's been used to discredit Ukrainians, and when it's been used incredibly intensively, it was where my research started, actually. It was investigating analogies of comparisons of Ukrainians with Nazis and the incredibly detailed form it took in 2014. When it's been used very intensively, it's just something you can pick up. It has the sense, and it also taps into a sense that many Russians have, of that feeling of being a bit betrayed by Ukraine anyway, because Ukraine has chosen not to be with Russia.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But when you get someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin publicly denouncing the premise of the war and saying things like that NATO never threatened Russia at all, did that have any effect?
Yes. I mean, it's very difficult to assess, especially because first of all, because the mutiny failed, and obviously now Prigozhin is dead, it can be quite difficult. But certainly Prigozhin's arguments had a lot of support, even if Prigozhin himself perhaps didn't have all of that support. And what's interesting, I mean, I've just come back from East Ukraine, from the sort of Kharkiv, Donetsk borders, and speaking to people who'd lived in occupied territories there, quite often what came out was this, when I asked them about, what were the Russian soldiers like? And of course, largely the descriptions were pretty horrific, to be honest. But a frequent element that did come up was the notion that at least some of the soldiers repented or asked for forgiveness because they realized just how much nonsense they had been fed. And at the same point, I mean, they didn't stop doing what they were doing, but there was some element of recognition. Of course, it's very difficult for me to be able to verify that independently, but this is something that a lot of different villages in different villages.
What were you doing there exactly, Ed?
So I was in East Ukraine I was in Kharkiv to see some friends, as you do. And then I also drove around East Ukraine, sort of over to closer to the border in the Izium region, as part of some research on Russian propaganda in the temporarily occupied territories and towards those territories that have been liberated. So the Russians often say, well, don't get too comfortable because we'll be back in 2 months. And it's quite frequent to have villagers asking, oh, is that true? And So I just want to look at that's why I was there. And then I had some meetings in Kyiv as well.
So in light of that research, is there anything you can tell us about what you've learned so far then?
Sure. I mean, it's still very much something that I'm sort of processing, both in terms of data and in terms of my own impressions, because I don't normally spend my weekends driving around war zones. But one of the more interesting elements is to do with how the villagers themselves try to find the good soldiers psychologically, and how they build on different elements. And then the other aspect in terms of the Russian propaganda is how they're trying to exploit the divisions between those who stayed during the occupation and those who left. And on both sides, you often see elements being played on. So, for example, the sense that those who stayed, there's something suspicious about them. Why did they stay? Why weren't they killed? Why weren't they raped? Even these are questions that have come up. Because, I mean, it's obviously very dark, but there we are. That's war.
How are those divisions being played upon then? Is it just what things that are being said? I mean, how is that being promoted, that kind of division between those who stayed and those who left?
Mm-hmm. There's different ways, and it depends a little bit on the demographic makeup of the audience. But there's quite a large number of very popular Telegram channels, for example, for those, because Telegram is also very popular in Ukraine. And there's also a number of well, bluntly, there's a number of collaborators who are in the local area, or who are sort of have been planted there for a long time, who help to maybe, let's say, spread rumors or whip this distrust up. And I mean, I don't want to suggest that this is all just propaganda. I think to a certain extent these divisions are going to exist anyway organically. What I'm really talking about is the exacerbation of those tensions and their instrumentalization for political use.
It's quite interesting to think of that when Ukraine wants to take all of its territory back, all of the occupied territory, to wonder how on earth you bring about a sustainable peace and you repair that kind of damage that has been done.
Yes, I think so. I mean, in any war, you're going to have collaborators. So, I mean, I think that is an element of war. People are people. But for a sustainable peace, I think it then just takes us back to some of the issues we were discussing at the start, really, because a military solution to this is, in my view, necessary. But it's necessary, at least in part, in order to be able to have the political solutions that will be needed, because Russia will not negotiate properly with weakness. So Ukraine wants, let's say, all of its territory back, and I say good luck to it. But after that, there's going to also, even when it gets all of its territory back, there's still going to need to be a political solution, because, I mean, Kharkiv, the city, Ukraine's second city, is 30 kilometers away from the Russian border. So even if it has every single square inch, that's not going to be peace. So the military aspect, of course, while crucial, especially to those people who are currently living and being tortured in basements under Russian occupation, that's it, pretty crucial. It's not the end.
I just wanted to ask you one more question about your time in eastern Ukraine. You mentioned how villagers were looking for the good soldiers. What do you mean? They were looking for the Russians that were going to treat them the best? Is it just a question of survival, the best you can, or what do you mean?
No, I mean, they tried to find the ones who weren't monsters in their view. So what was interesting is when we spoke to different people, they would say, oh, this group, for example, the people from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, they were the worst. They were horrible. And so were the young ones. But the older ones, they actually weren't so bad. They kind of understood. I felt like they understood. And those would be the older residents who would say that. And then when you spoke to, for example, some maybe poorer residents, they would talk about the fact that it was the younger ones who were from the villages in Russia who understood, and they were just nicer because they were from the people, they were sort of working class or poor. So people found the soldiers who had similar backgrounds or some similar element to them and almost projected their need for, because it's a lot to be confronted with what those villagers have been confronted with, and they tried to find humanity. And I'm not saying, perhaps it just so happened that all those soldiers, as they said, in those different villages, sometimes the same villages, different groups were suggested, but maybe they were all nice and it's completely as they said. But it came across to me as an effort to to try to find the good in a really pretty bleak situation.
It's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that with us. Just to go back to Yevgeny Prigozhin, when the plane crashed, assuming he was on it and he got killed, I mean, was there much public interest in Russia?
Yes, there was, particularly among, in general, the whole Prigozhin affair, put it that way, was much less covered on television than it was on Telegram. But on Telegram, it was really very, very prominent. And very few people, interestingly, thought the Ukrainians did it in sort of polling that was done the following day. Of course, very few people thought that Putin did it either, but that's where fear aspect could come in, whereas there would be no fear in saying that the Ukrainians did it. But yes, there was a lot of interest, but now the problem with Russian politics is it's an incredibly, and the socio-political spaces, it's incredibly depoliticized. People really do say things like, oh, well, what can I do? I'm just a little person. Oh, well, I stay out of politics. And I think if Yevgeny Prigozhin's mutiny had been successful, he would have been able to rely on a fair amount of support. I'm not saying a similar amount to, I'm not saying a majority, but a decent basis. But the fact that he failed really meant that a lot of respect for him was lost, and you saw opinions really turn against him. If you look even at polls, there was one poll that was done just the day before the mutiny, and then they followed up like 2 days afterwards after it sort of failed, and it was remarkable how many people moved from, yeah, I actually quite like him, to, oh, I don't know.
And now there are reports that his 25-year-old son wants to take over Wagner, and yet we see Putin meeting the former Wagner commander, Andrei Troshev, at the Kremlin. Are there any clues as to what's going on here?
Broadly, the biggest clue, I suppose, is just the Kremlin's behavior in general and the behavior of the elites around the Kremlin, which is competition for resources. So different parts of Wagner or different parts of Prigozhin's empire, straight away were then redistributed. So some of it to Nikolai Patrushev's son, Nikolai Patrushev being the head of the Security Council and very close to Putin advisor. Other elements were given to Putin's mistress, for example, some of his media, the troll farm, some of his media empire. And now, but they trod a fair amount more carefully with Wagner itself, because Wagner fulfills quite a sui generis role in Africa, to put it euphemistically. And it's not necessarily, although the Ministry of Defense would like to be able to control it, there are some pretty obvious downsides to that. One of them is Wagner is genuinely quite an effective fighting force, and bringing it under the Ministry of Defense would probably be the quickest way to make it much less effective for various reasons. And the second one is that the Wagner fighters themselves would not be particularly happy. And so what we hear Yevgeny Prigozhin's son doing at the moment is trying to negotiate an exchange of Wagner to Rosgvardia, which is like the National Guard, which is headed by Zolotov, who has had decent relations, I suppose, with the private military, with the mercenaries at various points. So it's a battle for resources. It's a battle for independence of Wagner, and the notion that it's just the Kremlin trying to completely destroy Wagner and impose it is not quite correct. In some ways, they're almost not sitting back, but they're watching to see how the game plays out a little bit. Though of course they will intervene if at any point it feels like it's not in their interests. So the game being the competition between Ministry of Defense and Wagner.
Interesting to watch on and see what happens with that. Now, you said earlier that the Russian public were unnerved and concerned when mobilization was announced. What about the death rate? Because there's so little information about how many Ukrainian and indeed Russian forces have died in this war. Do you get a sense that the public are worried about this, that they're asking questions? Because everyone must be affected in one way or another.
The mothers, of course, they want to know where their sons are, but I mean, they don't know that they're dead. For example, I mean, we all heard the stories about the mobile crematoria, and in general, this came up again. We were in one particular village, and all of the villagers were telling us about a big fire that destroyed a sunflower field. And I started to listen, and they explained that when the Russian soldiers arrived to occupy their village, they went to a sunflower field. They took lots of dead bodies of their fellow soldiers, and then they set up the hugest fire that the villagers had ever seen, and cremated all of the bodies. And again, I can't verify this, but they're all talking in quite a lot of detail. I don't have any particular reason to doubt them. Nobody was asking them, oh, did the Russians? They just sort of came out with this description. And this is a story that also comes up anecdotally quite a lot across different, conversations, not just my own. I'm with from other journalists, from other sort of people serving soldiers, like etc., etc. So a lot of them, it won't be known that they're dead, and it might be pretty hard to even ever find out really how they died. So that's one aspect that's important. The other aspect is that most of these people who've died are from poorer regions, from areas that bluntly are more likely to accept it and much less likely to protest, or to even know how to go about making that sort of political action.
Yeah, I wonder why it is. I mean, you were saying that mobilization, that the richer people manage to evade it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, because they can buy bron, which is like get out clause as mobilization. You can buy a stomach problem, or an eyesight problem, and also because actually mobilization is applied much less vigorously in the more European places. So in Moscow, for example, the Moscow mayor Sergei Sobyanin, he really protected the Muscovites last September. Mobilization really only went on for a couple of weeks, and even then it was a bit half-hearted, because everybody knows that it wouldn't be worth, everybody in the Kremlin knows it wouldn't be worth the trouble, because they might actually come out and cause hassle. And it's important to the Kremlin that popular support, or at least popular approval, acquiescence to the war, remains high.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, you said earlier that there is a general feeling amongst the public in Russia that, what can I do? What difference can I make? What can I do about it? And, we've seen Russia being attacked by drones, Moscow in particular, partisans seizing territory. I mean, what really would it take, do you think, for the Russian public to reject Putin's narrative?
I think it will take the defeat of Putin. I think it would take the defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine. I think that opinions like that, worldviews like that, very rarely change without something quite drastic changing in reality, the facts changing. And I think that's probably the only thing that would dislodge that now.
And part of Putin's strong desire is to make Ukraine Russian, or at least to put it under Russia's control. Is that an ambition which chimes with the average Russian, and how is that message being sold?
Yes, it is a message that chimes. So the notion that Ukrainians are really Russians, that they're all kind of brothers. I mean, this is something that chimes. Whether or not many Russians would have, for example, started the invasion over it is a different question. But the invasion has started, and but yes, I mean, that notion that Russia has a right to Ukraine, it's all sort of mixed in with origin stories as well. So Russia claims itself as the inheritor of Kiev and Rus, which obviously has its basis in Kiev. And it's this notion that they are just one people, and that Ukraine is an artificial idea set up by the Austro-Hungarians, or perhaps us Anglo-Saxons, depending on who you want to ask, that's used as an anti-Russian weapon. I mean, these are Putin's words from his writings. But they are this notion that ultimately Russians are not fighting Ukraine or Ukrainians. They're fighting a small band of Nazis or nationalists who've taken control and who are in the pay of the West. And that's who the real war, not the special military operation, but the real war is going on with. It's the West, which is trying to destroy Russia. Yeah, that has considerable resonance.
And what about the attitude towards the US and its allies? How has Putin tried to influence that, drawing upon history to galvanize support for the war?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, there's a sort of embedded sense of anti-Westernism that goes back for a very long time, in particular around notions that Russia is more traditional, Russia is somehow more spiritual and therefore better, purer perhaps of spirit than the West, and it represents a different civilization to the West, and a more authentic one, if we put it that way. But one of the main things that comes across, and I think this is sometimes underappreciated in the West, in Britain and in the US, but perhaps especially in Britain, is the sheer level of contempt that Russian elites have for the West. It's not a hatred, it's not a fear because we live better, it's a contempt because we have allowed them, we have sat there sort of making very nice sort of oratories and speeches about, oh, they're so awful on human rights, but we've taken these people's money, we've made their lives very easy, we've enabled them really to create, we enabled them to create that regime, and then at the same point they view the way that our societies function as weak. So again, this contempt of our hypocrisy, that we say one thing and we do another, contempt of our arrogance, as they perceive it. I'm not saying, I'm not taking a side, and if I had to take a side, I'd take the West side. But it has a role. They really genuinely believe, the elites, as they wrote in the National Security Strategy in 2021, that the West is not just decadent, the West is decaying, it's on its way out, and they just have to wait this one out, and everything that should be theirs will be theirs again.
In that light then, do you think that the overtures, the diplomatic overtures that were made by the Obama administration were misguided?
They were. It's very easy to judge in hindsight, and policy is very hard to get right. And I think that the people who made those overtures were made with the best of intentions. But looking back, so I don't want to sit as judge and juror because I've made mistakes too. But I think in hindsight, it's very difficult to come to any other conclusion that they were misguided.
When you say though that the Russian elite regard the West with contempt, I mean, what course of action could have been taken? I mean, how could that contempt have been averted? It suggests that unless you just strong arm and show strongman kind of politics, then there's no other option. Is that right?
Well, I think one of the issues is we probably worry a bit too much about what Russia thinks about us, and we can't really control that. And we often have very little idea what it thinks. Often I speak to people, even expert community, who really don't have a proper grasp on what that view is anyway. I think the main thing is to focus on what you can control. So what can the West genuinely influence? Can we influence Russian public opinion so that Russian people like us? No, probably not. And even if we tried, we really don't have the level of expertise to be able to do that sort of micro-targeting. And it's also a very difficult thing to do anyway, just speaking kind of from an academic point of view. So instead, we need to focus on what we can do. So what could we have done in 2014? Okay, we could have applied some much more serious sanctions, because really serious sanctions were not applied until the downing of MH17. We could have, say, cut off Russia from SWIFT then and made this huge mark. Fair enough if we didn't want to be involved militarily. And to be honest, the Ukrainian army was really we're in a deliberately bad state because that had been part of sort of Russia's engagement, but also, their own internal domestic corruption issues and Yanukovych issues. And if we come back to now, again, I understand why there's this interest in, is Putin dying of cancer? Or is so-and-so going to do this? Is there going to be this breakup? But if that happens, let that be a terrible thing to say about a human being, but it is Putin. Let that be a happy black swan event. We can't plan for that. We being sort of West, or people who would really quite like Ukraine to survive, we have to plan for that. None of those things are going to happen. We have to plan for the worst. And that means working out, okay, well, and then how do we control that? It doesn't mean sitting there thinking, it's all futile, we're all doomed. It means what can we control? Can we control whether or not Putin has cancer? Well, I don't know. That's getting outside of my expertise area. But what we can control is how many weapons we give Ukraine, how we help Ukraine to win. And Ukraine wants to fight. Ukrainians want to fight. So let's help them.
And with your historian hat firmly still on your head, how do you think future Russian generations will remember this particular period?
I hope very much that they remember it with deep shame. But I'm not entirely convinced that that will be the case. I imagine what will happen is there will be some attempt, even if Russia were to take a less autocratic path. I can't really see Russia taking a pro-Western path for a very long time. There's no real desire for it. The 90s discredited it. And bluntly, we have, and I have just called for this again, we have been supplying an awful lot of weapons that clearly are being used to kill Russians. So the notion that we can just make a nice sort of statement at the UN and Russians will say, oh, look, the West likes us, and that's going to overcome the fact that we've sent all of these weapons is a bit naive. I think that most likely what will happen is any effort will be focused on trying to blame just a select group of people. Maybe it'll end up being Putin. Maybe it'll be the bad boyas around the good Tsar. Maybe, like the Minister of Defense. Maybe it will be foreigners, the Chechens and the Buryats who did all of the war crimes, and not the good ethnic Russians. It's not clear who yet, but it will be it's a lot to sit there with the crimes, the horrors that the Russian army has committed and that Russian society has been very largely complicit in. And since Russia cannot be defeated in a way like in 1945 for obvious reasons, because it has a huge nuclear arsenal, it will be on Russians to sort of come to terms with their own history and to come to terms with any defeat. And I imagine, like most nations would, they will try to find a way to make it not about them, but about something else that happened, or somebody else, and a group a group can externalize.
Dr Jade McGlynn, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.